Welcome to Classroom 2 Courtroom. Here's your host, Scott Benton.
Hey everyone, Scott Benton here. I am the host of the Classroom to Courtroom Podcast. How are you? We are here to help you easily transition from law school as a law school student into your professional career as an attorney, and where we even make the practice of law fun. That's the whole point of this podcast. And today we're going to answer the question of how do you get something introduced into evidence? Now, as you may know, when it comes to trials, you better have solid evidence that not only meets the clear and convincing standard as closely as you can, which, by the way, is difficult, if not impossible to do, but you need to shoot for that anyway, that you have layer upon layer of different types of evidence and many versions of these different types of evidence in case one fails or is less convincing in order for you to win the case. In short, you need to have a lot of evidence, and you need to know that you never stop collecting new evidence, new layers, to add to the layers that you already have until the trial is over. But that gets us to the question of, is having all of this evidence, this literal mountain of evidence, all that you need to have for a trial? The answer would be definitely not. It doesn't matter if you have all the evidence in the world or more than you need to prove your case from multiple angles over and over again. What's important is that you know how to introduce something into evidence so that evidence can be officially recognized as a tangible component of the case that you're working on. This is actually not always easy or apparent. It's not always something that you can just figure out. But you want to know that's a thing. You want to know that getting evidence introduced into a case can be a difficult process. You want to essentially be forewarned that this might take a little bit of thought, thinking, planning, and strategizing. Now, one way that you're going to be able to get something entered into evidence is going to be through an expert witness. So let's say that you have a case where there's a will, and you're arguing that the signature on the will was forged. And in this case, you're probably going to want to get a lot of different writing samples, as many as you can, of the named signer, so that you can have the handwriting expert look at those and match them and determine whether or not that named person did sign that will, that document. So you might want to get signatures from like the DMV, for instance, or maybe you want to go see if there are Christmas cards or other messages that the named signer had written down somewhere, so that you have a collection of their handwriting. And you're also going to want to find anything you can to verify that document came from that person whose signature is said to be on the will. And you're trying to disprove this. You're trying to prove that the will is fraudulent. And so this could also include signatures like from bank documents, if there are any, or medical documents, or some other kind of document, anywhere that the named signer had written, especially their name, since you're looking for a signature. But also it helps if there are messages that they've written, because a lot of times that handwriting can have consistencies that will appear on the signature block, or maybe the will has other words written on it that you'll want to compare. Now, once you have all these writing samples collected and you bring them to a handwriting expert, they're going to base their own conclusions on the copy of this signed will against the writing samples that you've brought them. And assuming that you've been able to verify their authenticity, now the handwriting expert is going to be able to determine the relative consistency of the authentic signatures with the signature on the will, and then the handwriting expert is going to be able to present those documents as evidence into the case to prove his conclusions or her conclusions. Now, while the introduction of evidence into a trial through an expert witness, that's one way of getting evidence entered into a case, but it's certainly not the only way to get evidence entered into a case. There's actually many ways to do it, but it doesn't always become easy in order to accomplish that. This is why you need to pay attention to this subject, and you need to make sure that you're aware that getting evidence into a case It's not easy. Certainly not as easy it might appear in movies or television shows where an attorney will just show up with a document and stands up and I'd like to enter this into evidence, Your Honor. And the Honor says, bailiff, get that piece of paper and hand it to me. And this is Exhibit 25A or whatever it is. So if you don't have a lot of experience, and if you're a new attorney, you're listening to this podcast because you're trying to learn how to function as an attorney in your first job in the legal environment and as law schools, they're really not going to teach you how to practice as an attorney. They are going to teach you how to graduate law school, but learning how to practice as an attorney is something that you're going to learn really once you're in your job. And so the whole point of listening to this podcast is for you to get a head start before you get that first job so that you go into that firm and you have a better understanding and idea of what it means to practice law. And if you do get into a trial, even if it's early on, sometimes you're not going to see a trial right away. There could be examples of where that does happen. But if you don't have a lot of trial experience, and as a newer attorney in this job, by the time you get to a trial, chances are that you really haven't spent much time in a courtroom to understand this process of introducing evidence in the cases that you're working on. You're going to want to talk to your legal team or your colleagues. Maybe they're not in your firm, but they're friends of yours that you trust, and you're going to want to talk to colleagues about how to get evidence introduced into a case. Or go to your senior attorney. Senior attorneys often have a lot of courtroom experience, and they will have many ideas of how to get evidence introduced. For instance, you probably want to go talk to your paralegals. Your paralegals already know that you need more evidence. They're going to want to talk about getting your evidence entered into the case. They're going to have a lot of ideas about how to go about doing that and accomplishing that end. You're going to want to talk to your senior attorney who's likely done multiple cases, as I've mentioned. You want to ask them to suggest ways for you to get something entered into the trial as evidence. They're going to have all that experience to draw from. There's certainly going to be a wealth of information for you, very valuable information. So you want to make sure that anytime you're bumping up against something you're not quite sure how to move forward on, that you can go to your senior attorney and talk through that issue with them. And you don't want to spend too much time trying to figure it out because you're really trying to bill for your hours. And if you're going to spend an hour and a half trying to figure out how to get evidence introduced into a case, it really just becomes a waste of time when you could just go to a senior attorney and ask them instead, and they're going to give you some ideas right away of how to do that. You're going to save just an enormous amount of time. Because the last thing that you want to happen is that you show up at a trial and you have a bank record at the last minute, and you now want to include this bank record into evidence. I know it works in the movies and television, but really, in real life, that's going to be near impossible to do, which is another reason you want to be crystal clear on how you're going to get that document and others into evidence in the first place, and that you're working on doing that early on in the process when you're doing trial prep and when you're putting together your strategy. You want to make sure that you're entering this evidence early on so you're not sitting in that courtroom with a document like a bank record that you want to introduce into the record now. It's just going to be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to do that. So you don't want to get stuck in that situation where you end up having a key piece of evidence that you want to introduce into this case because you didn't talk to anybody at your firm, or you didn't talk to your colleagues, or you didn't learn how to do that. Now all you can do is sit in that courtroom with this key piece of evidence and just look at it, knowing that you can't enter it into the record, which you do not want to do. That's not going to help you, and it's not going to help your client prove much of anything. And in fact, it might actually be the difference between winning the case and losing the case. So I hope that's been helpful in answering the question of how do you get something introduced into evidence. I know that we didn't cover everything, but there are many ways to do it. There's no one right way to do this, and maybe somewhat different on a case-by-case basis. So as a new attorney, again, you're going to want to make sure that you're consulting with your team early on. That's the key, to figure out how to get your evidence introduced through proper channels. I'm Scott Benton. I'm the host of the Classroom to Courtroom podcast. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Now, if you do like this podcast and you're learning from the material that we're putting together and you'd like to get notified whenever we put together a new episode of this podcast, you can go to our website. Our website is classroom2courtroom.com. That's classroom, the number 2, courtroom.com. You can leave us your contact information and we will send an alert that we've posted a new episode of our podcast. And if this is information that you're enjoying, don't forget to share, like, and subscribe. And that way you can stay on top of all of the episodes. And until next time, we hope you'll join us in making the world a better place, one client at a time. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks for joining us on Classroom 2 Courtroom, the podcast designed to help launch your first-time legal career. If you have any feedback or ideas for episodes you'd like to hear, you can always find us at classroom2courtroom.com, where you can leave comments, ask questions, and even join our online community. And always remember, by becoming an excellent and confident practicing attorney, you actually make the world a better place. Now get out there and master the art of practicing law.